What?
Okay. Good afternoon and welcome to Psalms in Hebrew and Comparative Translations. We're going to start today with just closing out our conversation from last week because I left abruptly in the middle of everything because I got a phone call that my son was needed attention, and so then I left. But so last week we were talking about Psalm 53, and Psalm 53 is like Psalm 52, a maskil of David. So maybe not written by David himself, but written about David, or sort of written with David in mind. And maskil means that it's a more intellectual psalm, less of a um emotional psalm. It's not a song, it's a maskil. Maskil from the word haskala, meaning intellect or enlightenment. Um, and and so this Psalm 53, is understood, connected to be kind of a part of wisdom literature. And we talked about how the psalm is a rewriting of Psalm 14, or really, they're the same psalm
Oh my goodness.
with some differences. Okay, so Psalm 14 and Psalm 53 are the same psalm, but anytime you have two versions of one psalm, the very small differences matter a lot. Sort of like the Ten Commandments are basically the same in the book of Exodus as they are in the book of Deuteronomy. The few places where the Ten Commandments differ in their wording matter quite a bit in terms of the theological significance of the Ten Commandments in those contexts. And when Moses is retelling the story in Deuteronomy, what does Moses emphasize or de-emphasize? So, for example, for Shabbat in Exodus, Shabbat is connected to creation, but in Deuteronomy, Shabbat is connected to the Exodus from Egypt. And so, right, it makes sense that that wouldn't be how the Exodus narrative thinks about Shabbat, but it also makes sense that when you're retelling to the nation of Israel about Shabbat, if you're Moses, that you would connect it to the historical event of the Exodus, which is the most important historical event of their lives or their generation. So too, Psalm 14 and Psalm 53 are almost the same psalm, but the minor differences really matter. And we talked about the use of the word Adonai, that is to say, the Tetragrammaton, God's personal name, which Psalm 14 uses, as opposed to the word Elohim, which means God, and is a less personal name for God, which Psalm 53 uses. And I mentioned, only because I had read it in one of my books, that most of the Psalms in the mid 50s, most of the Psalms in the second book of Psalms is divided into five books, tend not to use the Tetragrammaton, tend not to use God's personal name. So uh that's a clearly an editorial choice in some sense. Like the person who codified this section of Psalms um rewrote some of those psalms to replace God's personal name with the word God. Uh, or,
Which way?
or that's one possibility. Or it could be that the people uh, uh, who arranged the book arranged all the psalms that referred to God that way in this section, as opposed to the ones that referred to God in the other way, got into other sections. So that's another possible way. Or it could be that there's a spiritual reason for using one name of God versus a different name of God, which is what I had suggested last time, that Adonai refers to God's mercy and Elohim refers to God's judgment.
Wow.
And so maybe God, you can have the same psalm, but you could look at it in two totally different lenses. You can look through the psalm through a lens of mercy, or you could look to the psalm through a lens of judgment and justice. And then we started to look at the differences in verses 5, 6, and 7, specifically in verse 6, where our Psalm 53, has a huge extra section that doesn't occur in Psalm 14. And so it says they will be seized with fright. That is the same in both Psalms, but Psalm 53 adds, "Never was there such a fright," right? Lo haya pachad, right? And so in Psalm 14, they have this fear. The enemies of God, the not righteous people, the sinners, they are seized with fright because God is present in the circle of the righteous. That's what it says in Psalm 14. But in Psalm 53, they the sinners, they have this fear that is overwhelming, that is completely unheard of. They've never had anything like it before, and they have it because God has actually scattered the bones of enemies, and God has completely rejected them. So they can see firsthand the way in which God responds to enemies of God. And that gives them a trembling like they've never seen before. And so that's where we got cut off at the last time we met. And both Psalm 14 and Psalm at 53 end with the same verse. Oh, that the deliverance of Israel might come from Zion. When God restores the fortunes of this covenanted people, Jacob will exult, Israel will rejoice. But what we find is that in Psalm 53, the word that is translated as deliverance is actually in plural. Yeshuot Yisrael instead of Yeshuat Yisrael. Yeshuat Yisrael means the deliverance of Israel. That's what it says in Psalm 14, and that's an accurate translation. In Psalm 53, it's translated the same way, but it maybe should be translated deliverances of Israel, Yeshuot Yisrael. That this psalm isn't just referring to one particular moment, as in David's life, but is referring to lots of possible times when uh, when Israel's fortunes are in the balance, and that God has an opportunity to enact restoration. And indeed, in our long view of Jewish history, we find that God's deliverances come regularly in Jewish history and not just once. Uh, I really like this idea that Rabbi Richard Levy left us with, that says, if we believe that we can trust no one but ourselves, and we feel weak or unconfident, we too feel that we might be gobbled up and that there is no one to protect us. Psalm 14 concludes this verse with the statement, God is their refuge. And that is true for us as well. To believe that God is present with us, that we can handle whatever should befall us because God is at our side, is the statement of a person of faith. The forces, human or otherwise, that we feel are besieging us do not invoke God. Itself a message that we need to invoke God, that we need to affirm the symbolic as well as the actual, the message of the, as well as the actual message of the creation of the state of Israel. From Zion, the rescue of Israel will arise. If in the aftermath of the terrors of World War II, a Jewish state could arise, the rescue of us as individuals is also possible. If in the shadow of the seemingly impregnable Soviet Union, Jews could finally be allowed to leave, then that cruel state itself could collapse. All this is a reminder that God has a majestic record of deliverances even in our own lifetime. There need be no terror. There is only the power of God. So that brings us to the close of Psalm 53, and we'll move on to Psalm 54. But before I do, does anybody have any comments? Yeah, Larry.
Yeah, it's an interesting flow using what you just said, that the fool is one who says there is no God, recognizing the concept of God. Before there was any concept of God, before anyone knew, there was fear but no terror. Now
Mm,
that you know there's God and you reject God, that fool will now know anxiety in a way that he didn't before. Instead of just fear, you're now anxious.
yeah,
Existential anxiety exists in the rejection of God. But when from Zion the rescuer happens, then there will be deliverances from that anxiety. Then you'll delight and you rejoice. There's just a wonderful moral lesson in that.
yeah,
They do not invoke God because they know about God but don't invoke him yet.
right, right. I think that's right. I like that understanding of the difference in tone between Psalm 14 and Psalm 53, where yeah, the fool the fool says there is no God. But by the time you get to Psalm 53, the fool says there is no God, but knows there is, because the fool has experienced God's power. Yeah.
No turning
I'll,
back.
I'll be right back.
All right, Martha.
It's out.
Okay. So setting aside Psalm 53, which I did want us to close that out. And also it's kind of helpful because we're going to read Psalm 54 and we're going to talk about it, but it's a short psalm and it doesn't occur in liturgy at all. And I did some research and I'll put it this way. I do not feel super passionately about Psalm 54. So we'll have to we'll have to find the passion as we go. Sometimes I am very excited about the psalm, but I was not unhappy with the idea that I would be able to use some of our time to finish up last week's class. All right. So, Psalm 54. I'll read it in Hebrew and some translations, and then we'll talk. Lamenatseach bin ginot maskil leDavid. Bivo hazifim vayomru leShaul. Hello, David mistater imanu. Elohim b'shimcha hoshieni uvigvuratcha tidineni. Elohim shema tfilati hazina le'imrei fi. Ki zarim kamu alai va'aritzim bikshu nafshi. Lo samu Elohim lenegdam. Selah. Hine Elohim ozer li Adonai b'somchei nafshi. Yashiv hara l'shorai be'amitcha hatzmitem. Bin dava ezbecha lach odeh shimcha Adonai ki tov. Ki mikol tzara hitzilani. Uv oivai ra'ata emi. For the leader with instrumental music, a maskil of David. When the Ziphites came and told Saul, "No, David is hiding among us." "O God, deliver me by your name, by your power, vindicate me. O God, hear my prayer, give ear to the words of my mouth. For strangers have risen against me, And those who are ruthless seek my life. They are unmindful of God. Selah. See, God is my helper. My sovereign is my support. God will repay the evil of my watchful foes. By your faithfulness, destroy them. Then I will offer you a freewill sacrifice. I will praise your name, eternal one, for it is good, for it has saved me from my foes, and let me gaze triumphant upon my enemies. Here's the King James Version. Save me, O God, by thy name, and judge me by thy strength. Hear my prayer, O God, give ear to the words of my mouth. For strangers are risen up against me, and oppressors seek after my soul. They have not set God before them. Selah. Behold, God is mine helper. The Lord is with them that uphold my soul. He shall reward evil unto mine enemies, cut them off in thy truth. I will freely sacrifice unto thee. I will praise thy name, O Lord, for it is good. For he hath delivered me out of all trouble, and mine eye hath seen his desire upon mine enemies. So, Psalm 54. Well, one thing that I notice right off the bat is that this is also a maskil le David. So it is one of these psalms that is called a maskil, a an intellectual psalm, just like Psalm 52, just like Psalm 53, so too also Psalm 54. And all three of these psalms, 52, 53, and 54, all have to do with David facing his enemies. In 52 is a named specific enemy. The Doeg the Edomite, who, according to the Book of Kings, really, really messes with David. I mean, and does a terrible, terrible thing. Slaughters all those people. Like, really not a nice guy. Really not a nice guy. And then Psalm 53 is also about a specific individual, the fool. Now, the fool could be anyone, but it's really addressed to a particular person. The Psalm 54 also refers to a specific incident in David's life, but unlike Doeg, who is a person of influence, who has a political affiliation, who's in the Saul camp, right? The Ziphites, they have no, they're not affiliated with David, they're not affiliated with Saul. They like this psalm is sort of about the surprise that you get when strangers are unkind for no reason. It's like, why? Why? Why did you do that? You didn't have any you didn't have any stake in this game, right? It's sort of, I think in real life, we're surprised when strangers are kind, and we're surprised when strangers are unkind. Like, we sort of think that strangers should be nothing. And this is sort of, I think, the tone of this psalm, or at least that's what I get. I get a sense of surprise. David says, for strangers have risen against me. Like, what is going on here? I get why somebody who is in the camp of Saul would would rise up against me, right? But why the strangers? And then David explains, but God's on my side, and these strangers are going to get what's coming to them. Larry.
It almost seems like he's teaching you, the listener,
Yeah.
that when you're in trouble, name it to God. Don't just rely on the practices and rituals and sacraments. Talk to God. God's here. You're in the presence of God. Articulate, look, strangers, even this, but you're talking to God. You're not just trusting God. You're acknowledging the presence of God, and you are entrusting God with the that you know that God sees this, but you want to talk to God and bring it to his attention.
Nice. So after we uh after we when we experience something that surprises us, when we encounter a challenge, when right, when something doesn't go our way, first bring it to God. God is a God can hold. God is a container for this kind of thing, right? God can take it. God can hold it. God is there for you, right? Spill it all out to God. God will gather it in.
Mhm.
And only after that, then bin davaz b'chalach, right? Then you can also do the rituals. Then you can offer your free will sacrifice. Then you can praise God's name. But first, pour out what happened to God.
Good
Yeah,
lesson.
share with God. Share with God what's going on in your life. And so David's teaching us, maybe that's why it's called a maskil, because this is it's an educational psalm, right? David's modeling for us what it means to pour out your soul to God, to share what's going on. Surely God is my help. God is the one who sustains me. Linda, what is your emotional experience when you read this psalm?
Yeah.
Linda,
What?
what is your emotional experience? What do you get when you read it?
It's very interesting. I sit where I live now. I'm at a table of six of us, and five of us pray to their God, and I pray to mine. And they pray in English, and I pray in Hebrew. So I talk to God every night at dinner. I tell him what's bothering me and what I wish could he help on that, and it would be wonderful if it wasn't happening anymore, and um, like that.
Wonderful.
With the people who sit with you at dinner.
Say it again.
With the people who sit with you at dinner?
Yeah. Well, in the beginning, they always wanted to pray to another person, God, and I said, look, this is a room of 100 people, and there's only like 10 of us Jews, and please don't make me pray to your God. I want to pray to my God. And so then they kind of said, okay. And so then I thought, I can't do this with them talking. I'll just talk in Hebrew to my God, and then I won't get confused with what they're saying. So that's the way it works.
All
Same God
right.
understands both languages.
God understands all the languages.
Say it again.
God understands all the languages.
Betach. I,
Right.
I, I am so grateful for Micah because I have been teaching, answering people's questions, about their God and my Bible and their Bible. And I always tell them there are many paths to God. Read Micah. It's in your Bible, it's in my Bible.
What about Micah do you like?
There are many paths to God. They don't understand, many people here don't understand the way I pray. And I just say there are many paths to God. We don't all have to pray the way you pray, and you don't have to pray the way I pray. There are many, many paths to God.
Hmm.
Well, you pray directly to God.
Say it again.
You pray directly to the same God who they're praying through somebody to God, your God, the same God. You just have a direct line.
Yes, exactly. But they also have a direct line in the way that they think about God.
Yes.
And that's what's so beautiful about Micah to me.
Yeah.
And they question, you mean your Bible is different than my Bible? And I said, yes,
No,
my
it's
Bible
not.
is this way.
Two-thirds of their Bible is identical to yours.
No, 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 it's not.
The front is all the Tanakh.
Say it again.
There's 900 pages in the Bible, roughly. 600 are yours, are ours.
No, no, no. I mean, maybe not. I understand that,
It's
but
only the last 300 that are added on.
yeah, that's what I say to them. You have added people to your God, to your Bible that aren't in mine. That's just the way it is. So you pray to your people, and they get very confused. Why can't it be this way? And I said, because there are many paths to God, and that's your path, and this is my path.
Yeah. So there are many paths to God is a very Jewish idea because Judaism is completely comfortable with the idea that not everybody in the world should be Jewish and that there are other paths to God.
And it's wonderful.
But Christianity, in its classical formulation, and I'm not saying every Christian, and I'm not saying every church, but Christianity in its classical formulation imagines a world, the ideal Christian world is an ideal where is a world where everybody is Christian.
Better. And also the
But
Hindu.
that isn't the case for Judaism. And I understand that not every Christian feels that way. But Christianity classically does feel that the it's a universal tradition. It wants everybody, it believes that everybody would be better off coming to God through Christianity. And Islam feels the same way. Islam also thinks that the best way to get to God is through Islam, and that no other ways uh, are particularly approved. And Buddhism thinks the same way. Everybody should be Buddhist, right?
Better. Can.
All of those are universalist traditions. Says Confucius says, I know the way. You follow my teachings, and that is the right way to be in the world. But Judaism doesn't believe that. Judaism believes there are many paths. And so when you say it's so easy, there are many paths to God, just the idea of there are many paths, is not a universally accepted teaching.
Jews understand that it's the same God.
Can. I mean, maybe not.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think that I'm very influenced by my teacher, Professor Stephen Prothero, of Boston University, who wrote a book called God is Not One. I mean, it's a provocative title. His point isn't that there isn't one God. His point is that when people talk about different paths to God, they often imagine that there's a mountain and God's at the top of the mountain, and there are different ways up. Some people take a tram, and some people walk a snake path, and some people walk on the old, Roman road, right? But there are a lot of different ways up the top of that mountain. But when we get there, we're all worshiping the same God. And Prothero says this is a misunderstanding of religion. Actually, there are many different mountains, and we're climbing different mountains. Now, you could still have that the mountains are all pointing up and up is all the same God, right? You can still extend the metaphor, but Prothero's point is that different religions see the world differently. And his point is when you distill a religion down to its most basic idea, every religion has a particular problem of living as a human being in the world that it's trying to answer, and it has a particular way of answering that problem. And so Christianity is really engaged with the problem of sin. And the answer that Christianity gives is uh is the it is the answer of um not redemption, that's not the right word. What is it in Christianity? That the
It's sacrifice also. The
Yeah,
sacrifice moves
right.
from sacrificing something to sharing in the sacrifice of the Mashiach.
Exactly. Right. Judaism, the problem that Judaism is solving is not the problem of sin. Judaism doesn't care that much about sin. Not that Judaism doesn't care at all about sin. Like, we have Yom Kippur, it's about sin. Like, we care about sin. But Judaism itself is more focused on this question of exile, of
Oh,
being of exile, of being separated, of having distance. Even the way that we talk about sin is that sins make you feel more distant from God. And so the answer is return, teshuvah, returning, turning back to the right, which is not how Christianity thinks. Martha.
Hi. Just a couple of things. Let's see. I just wanted to jump in a little bit. Okay, so I suspect that um, Christian theologically, whatever, um, when Lena said, you're praying to your God, I'm praying to my God, your God is that they would probably differ on that, that it's not actually like an intermediary in the commonly understood sense of that, but rather more of um, an aspect
Well,
of.
different Christians
Yeah,
feel
and
differently.
the other thing I wanted to say is that I was taking a class with Stephen Stark Reamer over at Temple Israel one day years ago, and he said something very interesting. He said, um, as he's very interested in the intersection of Judaism and Christianity, and he said, I've never had a real problem with the idea. And, he's not like saying he's a Christian, but he said, I've never had a real problem with the idea of a Trinitarian concept of God. He said, I feel that Judaism has always had at least like a bi face of God. And if you look at the wisdom literature and then you jump to that first paragraph in John, pretty much any knowledgeable Christian theologian will admit and agree that Christians took their theology of the Holy Spirit right out of the wisdom literature. And that just jumped, it just appears, in the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and blah, 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 all of that whole thing. And then you go back, and I was just like going, whoa. And when Stephen said that, I had to go back to that wisdom literature and the figure that dances before God and participates in his works. Hello. I don't know how much closer they could get to that theology of the Holy Spirit in Christianity. Just saying. So
Yeah.
little mishmash
I
there.
think if this topic really excites and animates you, the best book on the topic. I mean, there are several really, really good ones. But the best book on the topic is the Jewish Annotated New Testament.
I have it. I have it.
Okay.
It's the Christian Bible, the New Testament, but written with a commentary that shows how those texts were really written for a Jewish audience and how they are connected to to the Hebrew scriptures.
Okay.
And it is a very well done. It's Mark Zvi Brettler and God, what's her name?
Oh, Levine?
Jill Levine,
Yeah, Amy Jill Levine.
Amy Jill Levine. Anyway, very, very, very worthwhile. They also wrote a book that isn't a commentary on the on the New Testament. The Jewish Annotated New Testament is the first place to look. But if you just want like a book that is written with chapters like a normal book, the same authors wrote the Bible with and without Jesus.
And I've got that
And
one.
and they and what they did was they picked several chapters both from the Old and New Testaments, and they explain uh but especially Old Testament texts, especially Hebrew scripture texts like Psalms, and they explain how that text was used in Judaism, sort of in as much as we can tell how that text would have been understood by the pre-destruction of the temple Israelite cult, how it was understood in rabbinic literature, meaning the rabbis of the second, third, fourth, fifth centuries, and how it was understood in Christian literature, meaning the books of the New Testament, which were written in the first, second, and third centuries. So at the same time period as the rabbinic period. And what the church, how the church fathers understood. So when I taught Psalm 22, a couple years ago, when in this class, when we got to Psalm 22, I read the chapter on Psalm 22 from that book and was very informed by it. Psalm 22 is the one that begins, Eli, Eli, lama zavtani, my God, why have you forsaken me? Which is traditionally what Jesus says on the cross. And we looked at how Christians have understood that psalm, how Jews have understood that psalm, uh, and and the different ways that that psalm has been interpreted over time. And so, if you're just looking for a book, the Bible with and without Jesus is a good one. But the Jewish Annotated New Testament, that's the one that I think is the most clear uh, explanation, like of reading John or reading Matthew, understanding why what they say is not discontinuous from Jewish tradition until, Larry, it is discontinuous because of the way the Christian church has understood it.
Yes, it's an institutional error in the Christian church. Jesus never intended it to be a different religion. This is Judaism.
Yeah.
But I just look at him as a reformer.
That's
God,
right. I mean, I think that's right. And Brettler and Levine don't do it in that book, but I have seen a couple of really good articles that look at the statements of Beit Hillel, the statements of Hillel from just before the destruction of the temple, which is the time that Jesus lived, and the statements of Shammai, right? And in rabbinic literature, we put Hillel and Shammai up as like opposite ends of a spectrum. It's really interesting to look at the statements of Hillel and the statements of Shammai juxtaposed with the statements of Jesus as contained in the New Testament, since they were all rabbis preaching at the same time period to the same folks. And you can see where Jesus sometimes takes the Shammai position and sometimes takes the Hillel position, where Jesus is actually trying to chart a middle course between these two extremes. Now, Judaism ends up being a religion of both and, right? Judaism ends up saying Hillel and Shammai are both a part of our tradition. And we don't need to choose between these extremes. We don't need to pick a medium path. We can say that both these and these are the words of the living God, right? So Judaism makes a choice to include the whole big tent. Christianity doesn't do that. Christianity doesn't say there are multiple ways to reach God. Christianity says, nope, the Jesus way is the way.
That's it.
And look, Jesus is trying to adopt a middle path, right? Like Jesus, like kind of in a pre-Aristotle kind of Aristotelian way, is trying to chart a compromise course, right? Taking some of this and some of this and some, middle of the road kind of way of being, right? But Jesus, Jesus is uh Jesus's followers end up having a very different sort of theological approach, where Judaism says all of these are the words of the living God. Christianity says, nope, we have one teacher who gives us the words of the living God, and everything else is not. And I do think that is a significant theological difference. And but a reasonable one. Like reasonable people can understand why that difference happened. What's so tragic is that the followers of Jesus then ended up trying to impose that one version of what the words mean onto everybody else, including onto other Christian sects, right? Yuval Noah Harari points out that if they had accepted, if instead of accepting Timothy, the church fathers had accepted some of the more gender inclusive church teachings, which there were in the 2nd century, like it could have changed the whole course of human history. But instead, they, by canonizing Timothy, which is profoundly misogynist text, they ended up losing Jesus's real message because there was no self-correcting mechanism for the church. Once the church had adopted this as doctrine, it went into history as that is the doctrine of the church. Whereas Rabbinic Judaism has much more self-correcting mechanisms because we preserve every minority opinion. And a later tradition can say, nope, we're going to go back to that previous tradition. But you're absolutely right, Martha, that ultimately, when you just look at the New Testament, which are especially not the letters, which are later, but if you look at the 1st and 2nd century texts, those texts are very, very much continuous with Jewish thinking and Jewish practice, and and with the scriptures. And Matthew knew that. When Matthew was writing, Matthew was really cared about his Jewish audience. When you read the Sermon on the Mount, it is completely it's completely connected to the words of Micah and the words of Isaiah. It doesn't come out of nowhere. And that's what you'll get if you read the Jewish annotated New Testament, because when you get to the Sermon on the Mount, they'll show you all of the stuff that leads to that. And when you get to Jesus on the cross, there's a note there that explains how Christians understand Isaac, who is almost sacrificed, as a prefiguration of Christ, who is sacrificed.
So anyway, that's my dinner table.
I think that's I think it's great. The next time I come and teach at Kingsway, you should invite your dinner table to come along.
Sure.
It's
I look at myself as very much
a 1st century
a Matthew Jewish Christian.
Yeah.
I have trouble calling myself a Christian because of what it's come to mean. And other people say, are you a completed Jew? And these words don't mean anything because our words are so stupid That's why Jesus spoke in parallels. He used analog rather than digital communication. Will you people stop doing digital and go back to analog, which is isomorphy, systems, relationships. This is not this cut dried thing. It's think, struggle. This is what Israel means. He wrestled with God. And he gave him a good whack to make it harder because it's the struggle that's important.
Yeah. And
And
look,
the
Larry, I completely respect that. And I think that rabbinic Judaism does it better. Like for me, my theology, I like better the approach of the both and the extremes. The these and these are both the words of the living God. And let's preserve every minority opinion because a later generation might rethink this and want to come back to that, right? Shammai wouldn't teach the opinions of Beit Hillel, but Beit Hillel taught all of the opinions, Beit Shammai, Beit Hillel, and everything in between, right? And to me, that approach works for me theologically. I think rabbinic Judaism like really captures that. But what you're saying about Jesus as a struggler with God, Jesus as a good Jew, like I can get behind that.
I look at myself as a Jewish evangelist to the Christian community to teach them to be better Christians by being Jewish. What if you say you're Jewish, nobody would come? I look at Christianity as the most brilliant marketing campaign of Judaism. God has done this thing, this
There is
wonderful
something
thing.
to that.
I am on his side. I'm trying to help the world become Jewish. And if we have to call it Christianity, so be it. But it allows me to preach Judaism in Christian churches. And I tell them the first thing I say is, I'm Jewish. I'm also an elder in the church, so I can speak. But what I teach them is what Jesus is saying is Jewish. So I look at myself as there isn't a word for me. Yeah, am I Christian? Yeah, I'm a Presbyterian. I'm also Catholic and an Assembly of God, and I am Jewish fundamentally. You don't stop being Jewish. Being Jewish is a state of being. It's not a religion.
I
It's
say that all the time.
yeah.
That Judaism isn't a religion.
That's why I've just gravitated to you, Rabbi. You're my rabbi.
I think that's great. And I really liked I really liked your brother, and I know that you met me through him, and I think that that's terrific.
It's the way it's supposed to be.
That is the way it's supposed to be. Yeah, and I really enjoy our differences of opinion about the theology. I think it works. It's okay. I have a great amount of respect for different ways of thinking, um and I think that's important.
My way is not that different from yours.
That's
Yeah. Yeah.
We are all sons and daughters of God. It's just we are in different stages of realization of what that means.
Could be. Could be. I mean, I definitely agree with the first half.
Uh,
Yep, we are all children of God.
I was thinking about this stuff one day. I think Paul goes into anyway, I just thought of it. I thought, what if we take that accident of history? Because I consider Christianity as a separate religion to be an accident of history. And what if it had just remained within Judaism? And I thought, what I know, I mean, I 69 years old, what growing up in, in Judaism, I mean, what I have understood, I thought if we had kept the Jesus figure, I think it would have no, but it used to be very hard to be, it may still be hard to convert to Judaism, to become Jewish. I thought it would not have gotten out to the majority of the Gentile world.
Right.
That's really my take on it.
Yeah, I
And
mean, that was Paul's insight. Paul
yeah,
said, up until now, in order to be Christian, you had to first be Jewish.
right.
In order to be a follower of Jesus, you first had to have circumcision and keep Shabbat. And he said,
Kosher.
but Jesus's message is broader than that. It's more universal. It's not just for people who are Jewish.
Right.
And we can bring the best ideas of Judaism out to the rest of the world
Yeah.
through Jesus. And Paul says in the letter to the Ephesians or the letter to Galatians or whatever, one of those, he says, okay, you can accept people into the church even if they have not been circumcised and don't accept the commandments.
And
And
eat
that
treif. And eat treif.
right,
Hey,
that's
great.
the big
Right?
difference. But
Yeah.
well,
Okay.
circumcision, I think, in the letter to whatever the letter is, Galatians or Ephesians, the circumcision is the big sticking point. People really didn't want to do that.
As it were.
Yeah,
Rabbi,
yeah.
Adult circumcision is not something that people are eager to do.
I totally hear that.
Uh,
That's why we do it at 8 days. Linda.
I just wanted you to know when uh, I was talking to one of the chefs, I guess, at Kingsway, and I said, "What'll happen to us, for Passover?" And he said, and Andreas said to me, "We're going to do they have a menu that we can choose from 3 different dinners, and then they have other menus." But he said he's going to add a 4th choice for the 8 days of Passover, and they're going to be for Passover. They're going to be Passover food. So he was asking me, what kind of foods to you? And I said, talk to Susan Weil because she's much more Orthodox than I am, and she can give you the real, the real, deal kind of thing. So he did, so that we're going to have brisket. I just thought it was great.
That's great.
It sounds wonderful. And the other thing that fascinates me about this, being with so many different people all at once, is that the Christian people at my table said that their churches make the Seder plate with all the different
Yes.
symbolic things there.
Yes, how I feel about that is profoundly
What?
against it.
What?
I'm profoundly against it. I think it's cultural appropriation. I think
I-
churches shouldn't do it.
Say that again.
As a rabbi, I have no problem with Christians coming to a Jewish person's house for Seder and experiencing it and having a religious experience there. But I have a real problem with Christian pastors who maybe haven't ever been to a Seder doing something that is based on what modern Jews do and doing it as a way of connecting to historical Jesus for their congregants. Because what it does is it reinforces the idea, two problematic ideas. First of all, it reinforces the idea that Judaism hasn't changed since the time of Jesus, which is not true, right? The Judaism that Jesus had, if you could even call it Judaism, which I don't know if you could, but because now what we have is rabbinic Judaism, which is different from what Jesus had. But okay, the Judaism that Jesus had, of course, had Passover, but it didn't have a Seder. The earliest Seders are from the 2nd century, after Jesus.
I know. I'm not talking about that though, because
No,
that's
but
churches. I'm just
what?
talking about what we're doing at Kingsway.
I know, but you said that they were describing how their churches had Seder plates.
Yeah, but that's their churches. They're not.
I know. I'm not upset with Kingsway for having a Seder. Kingsway should have a Seder. Kingsway should have Seder plates. My problem is with the churches.
Yeah, but
Churches should not have Seder plates because that is cultural appropriation. And it reinforces this idea that Judaism hasn't changed in 2,000 years. which reinforces the Christian doctrine of supersessionism, the idea that Jesus came to fix all of what was wrong in Judaism, and right, like a big part of Christian anti-Semitism comes from this idea that Judaism is outdated. But I actually think it's a misunderstanding of history. Jesus had maybe a Passover experience, but it wasn't like what we do today. That's my personal thought.
I don't think anti-Semitism is so much because of looking at Judaism as outdated, ancient. It's the thing that they create in their mind is that Jews reject the basis of their faith, of the Christian's faith, which is that Jesus somehow uniquely is the Son of God, as opposed to a Son of God.
Right.
And it's there.
Well, I think that's part of it. But supersessionism is like a really big part.
That is a terrible damn thing, and it is a damned thing.
I know. And when you call the Old Testament as opposed to the New Testament, right? As opposed to what I try to do, which is to refer to them as the Hebrew Scriptures and the Christian Bible, right? The appellations Old and New like fit with that idea of supersessionism. And look, I don't think the loving, like God-fearing pastors in the Christian churches that you're talking about, Linda, like the other residents at Kingsway who went to church and saw a Seder plate on the altar at the church, they're not doing it to be supersessionist. But the point is not to say, oh, Judaism hasn't changed in 2,000 years. The point is to connect to Jesus. My problem is that if you try to connect to Jesus by doing what Jews today do, you're not actually connecting to Jesus. You're connecting to something else.
Yeah.
Which is actually nice. It would be nice for Christians to connect to modern day Jews. Right? Like that would be good. But the way that you connect to modern day Jews is not by taking their symbols and putting them on your altar. The way that you connect to modern day Jews is by inviting a rabbi to come to your church on the Sunday before Easter to talk about the differences between Judaism and Christianity. There's a way to do it right and a way to not do it right. That's what I'm saying. I'm saying it would be really nice to have churches to reach out to me and to say, Passover's coming up, Easter's coming up. Can we talk about that together? Can we be in relationship together, Jews and Christians? I'm for that. I'm for interfaith relations. My problem is that if you put the Seder plate, the modern Jewish Seder plate that has charoset on it, which they didn't know about in the first century, that has a roasted egg on it, which they didn't do in the first. Like you have this thing, right, that is not like what it was at that time period, and you put it on your altar and you say, look, we're connecting to Jesus because this is what Jesus would have had on his table at the Last Supper, which is exactly what they do. Like, I promise you, that's what they do. Then what you're saying is that Judaism hasn't changed in 2,000 years, even if that's not the point of what you're saying. It's like you're making a golden calf. You're trying to connect to Jesus, but instead you're missing the historical boat. You're not, and it does have a negative effect. Maybe it's not. Maybe anti-Semitism isn't the right word, but a kind of derision toward what?
Derogation.
Yeah, about what modern Judaism is.
When is the time that you're going to the church and the woman from the church is coming to us?
I went this past Sunday, 2 days ago, to church, and she's coming this coming Saturday, which is Erev Pesach. But as far as I know, she's not talking about Easter or Passover, although she's welcome to. And I talked about Zionism, which I did connect to Passover a couple of times, but that wasn't my main focus because she told me what their Old Testament reading, their Hebrew scriptural reading was Psalm 126, which is a psalm about Zionism. So I started there, and I used the words of the psalm to talk about my topic. People have a lot of misunderstandings of what Zionism is, and I wanted to share an alternative viewpoint. Plus, I really love psalms. So I really enjoyed talking about a psalm in church. I think it went well. I do have a recording of myself doing it, so you email me, I can send you the recording. All right. Let me close by reading the spiritual applications, and then my hope is that I will have time this week to prepare for next Tuesday. But since Sunday and Monday are both Yom Tov Chag, there's a chance that I won't be prepared. If by Friday afternoon it seems like I'm not going to be prepared, I will send an email canceling our class on Tuesday. But my hope is to be prepared and to meet next Tuesday. So for right now, we'll say class is on.
It's the 15th.
The recurrent theme of enemies, as we have often noted, is hard for modern, secure readers of Psalms. An alternative to this theme appears here in the headnote. Opposed to the betrayal of the Ziphites in the Samuel passage is the sacrificial loyalty of Saul's son Jonathan, who, despite his awareness that David will prevent him from inheriting his father's kingdom, befriends his beloved friend, who he knows is God's choice for king. One is tempted to see verse 8, with a free will offering I will bring a sacrifice to you, as an example of Jonathan's service to God. In some ways, Jonathan provides the answer to the poet's plea for deliverance. And Yonatan, means God has given, or free will, right? The gift. Another teaching of this psalm can be found in the juxtaposition of verses 5 and 6, that the poet equates strangers and sinister schemers, as we note above, a problematic consequence of the group loyalty of the covenant. Though through God, who created all people, who is a helper to all well-meaning people, no one is really a stranger. Though the word for stranger here is zar, meaning literally a strange person, and not ger, meaning a sojourner, the word that often describes us in Egypt, the connection still holds. That we were strangers in Egypt should make us sensitive to all who are strangers in their lands, and render us wary of falling into Pharaoh's trap of seeing every stranger as a menace. Which I think is a beautiful way of concluding on this class right before Pesach, that we should be wary of being like Pharaoh, and instead we should respond in the way that the Hebrew Scriptures does, and which the Christian Jewish scriptures continue, which is to try to show love for those who are strangers in our midst. Shabbat Shalom and Chag Sameach.
Yom Lecha.
Shalom. Chag Sameach.
Hi, Martha.
Thank you. Thank you, Rabbi.
Thanks, Larry, Martha, Linda, everybody.